Fast forward 9 months after lockdown, rolling back, allowing people to go out, our education system has not improved. There have been advances in the medical field, there have been advances in the technology field, but they are still trying to figure out education. And unfortunately, as we spoke back months ago, the concern is that we are increasing the chances of our children ending up in prison because the gaps in terms of academics is real. Our teachers are struggling, our children are not logging on, parents feel at a loss, and we are relying on our administration who are not coming up with answers, but actually frustrating the public. So we wanted to have a conversation this evening. We wanted to talk about the work that is being done, but also talk about some tangible solutions that we, the community, can do. And I'm excited that Marlon is here with me. We are always in great conversation. And I personally know Marlon from around the way. We're both Brooklyn natives, growing up together. But in our lives, we've taken different paths. But the beautiful thing is that we've come back together, and it came through his incarceration. So back in 2000 and I want to say 2003, when I decided to become a teacher at Dr. Susan S. McKinney in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, one of the things that I realized is that our young people had an affinity for thinking that prison was a lifestyle that was something that they wanted to aspire to get into. And I really couldn't understand that. A lot of them had parents who were incarcerated, godparents, cousins. And so I didn't understand why they would want to repeat the cycle. But after sitting with many of them, I recognized that there was never a truth told about what was life like in prison and what led to our young people having family members that ended up in prison. So after having conversations, it just came to me that they needed someone who had gone through that, who had that experience to actually speak to them. I could try to do a good job of it, but at the end of the day, I was just Miss Lopez, the teacher who was always on their back. And I was almost like a big sister to many of them, because as young as I look now, I looked younger. So I remember reaching out to Marlon and saying, sending him a letter, and I hadn't spoken to him since he was incarcerated. First, I sat down with his family and I said, I really want him to be able to help me, help these young people, because I see so much potential in them, but I don't want them to get caught up in the system. And so Marlon agreed. And so because of that, we were able to start a letter writing correspondence program. And so throughout this conversation, we're actually going to meet with two of my scholars, one that I had at Dr. Susan S. McKinney, and then Marquise Williams, who I actually was the teacher of at, the principal of at Mott Hall Bridges Academy. But before we get into that, we wanted to start the conversation with Greer Ellis. And, you know, before people got on, we were actually having a family reunion, and Marlon and Greer were talking about the connection that they had through Greer's dad. So I'm going to transition it over to Marlon, and we're going to get into a great conversation. And we want to encourage folks that if you have any questions or comments throughout our conversation, to please feel free to add it to the chat. You're on mute.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Nadia. And yes, it's an honor to be on this conversation here. I think a very timely sort of conversation to have. Fortunately and unfortunately, it'll be a conversation that we'll be having for some time around how the impact of this, you know, how the pandemic is impacting families and kids, particularly in education systems, and the residual effects of the immediate impact that is yet to come. Yeah, but without question, Ms. Ellis, Greer Ellis, who this first time I think we actually in any sort of public space speaking. We may have met before, but we're not too sure. But she's definitely a friend, a family of HALA, How Our Lives Don't Go Together, a program that myself and a couple of other guys started back when we were in Otisville. Not too long after Nadia and I started working with each other with the students at Susan S. McKinney. Also, Dr. Miss Ellis, Greer, your pops, Eddie Ellis, was who we were speaking about, who is a mentor to many, a mentor, I think, a movement leader in terms of formerly incarcerated people nationally. I don't think people really fully. It's good that in so many ways people don't know where the source started. And what I mean by that is that people just say it effortlessly. Where people say formerly incarcerated people, like that started with Eddie Ellis and his crew, and all over the country. That's in policy when we listen to folks at the top of the field in terms of criminal justice and policy, they also use that term. That's a credit to your father. So I'm happy to be in conversation with you around this sort of issue. Greer? You on mute. You on mute. Same thing. We all do the same thing. Don't worry. It's on Zoom. Or we got to just imagine like we got to open the door in the room that we walking into. There you go. Went back on. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now. That's right.
Okay. So I'm honored to be on this panel tonight. Thank you all for inviting me. So one thing I just want to say is that my father always stressed the importance of education. And even though he was incarcerated, he was involved in every aspect of my education from middle school through high school. Like he knew all my teachers, and like he was serious about like, send me that paper, I want to take a look at it. I'm like, really, Dad? And he was very serious, and there were times when I procrastinated about that, and he would be like, okay, y'all coming up this weekend, bring that paper with you. And we would be in that visiting room with that marker, and he would use that red pen. Oh my goodness, I hated it, but it strengthened my writing skills, and he helped me to be a better student, and he instilled that in me. He used to always talk about the 5 P's of success, and he would say proper preparation prevents poor performance. And man, I was like, all right, Dad, I got it. He would drill that in me all the time. But I'm thankful now because it really has helped me, right? He would always say that knowledge is power, and it's something that once you acquire it, no one can take it away from you, right? Mm-hmm. So I always try to, tell my sons, right, even though neither one of them finished college, right, they still talking about they want to come back. They're in their 20s now. So I'm letting them live their life, right, and find their path. But I'm constantly like, yo, when you going back to school? Like, you got another year, when you going back to school, right? And trying to continue to help them to understand the importance of that.
Thank you for that. Thank you. It's interesting. As you were speaking about how your father was being a father to you while he was inside, I didn't come up with it, but a term I wrote down was remote parenting, right? So in so many ways, I'm just sort of thinking about using, the contemporary moment and connecting that to incarceration, obviously, in terms of like there's an interruption of life, of normality, what we understood it to be. How do we, despite that interruption, still maintain familiar relationships, right? And in this case, I think pivoting to the conversation, and despite this disruption that we have now, how do we maintain, or not even maintain, I don't think maintain it, how do we create better systems of education for our young folks, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of think about that pivot, because one thing, as we sort of direct these connections, Nadia always speaks of, she opened a school to close a prison, right? And Eddie Ellis, just for the people listening, him and a lot of other people who were inside, including Lukman, I'm just naming people, but like they had created this document called The Non-Traditional Approach to Social and Criminal Justice. And one of the quotes out of that document that they prepared while they were incarcerated in the early 90s, that has pretty much leads to the policy that many in terms of reform, people speak about reform, a lot of the policies are derivatives out of that document. And one of the quotes, and I think I'll pass on to you, Nadia, or Greg, either one, is a quote that stands out to me, and it is, there are no prison problems, there are only community problems. Mm-hmm. There are no prison problems, there are only community problems. And I always give the caveat when I use that, in that it's not saying that there aren't issues particular and nuanced to incarceration. Of course there are, but even in this moment, particularly now with COVID, right, is exposing the fact that the way that we treat certain people, that we're okay with treating certain people, in particular people who are incarcerated, is the same way we are treating people who come from those same communities, those same carceral communities. That in that same report that those gentlemen put together, these particular neighborhoods, back then it was 7 neighborhoods in New York City that produced 75% of the people who were incarceration in New York State. The numbers scatter a little bit in terms of where they are. It also includes parts of Buffalo and Syracuse now, but it's still the Black and brown communities, right?
Yeah.
They're prison problems,
Yeah.
only community problems.
Yeah, it's still Brownsville, it's still East New York, it's still Far Rockaway, the Bronx, and Bed-Stuy, even though there's gentrification happening. So it's down to, I believe, like they've cited 5, and I'm sure there's still areas that are contributing, but those 5 are the main areas. And so to that quote, the connection that you're saying, like Greer, with your dad, even though he was incarcerated, he still was providing the parenting, holding you accountable. He didn't allow the walls, he didn't allow the visiting hours to dictate how he showed up in your life as a parent, right? And so in many ways, I had to formulate this relationship with Marlon to do the work in our school to try to mimic what your dad was doing to help give some guidance to my young people who didn't have that, right? And so it first started with Nolita. And so Nolita, sassy as she could be, yeah, she always want to look up, but she was, right? She was the picture perfect of the Black girl who was sassy with the attitude, who was going to challenge you. You said the moon was white. She said, so are we doing colorism? Is it like a race thing? Why I gotta be white? Like she was that person. And I would be like, are we gonna argue about that? Right. But it was her just trying to, for me, I said, you know what? She kept me on my toes. Right. And I'm just using that as an example, but Nolita wasn't just going to allow you to teach her anything without you getting a source. Like, prove to me where you got your information from. And so Nolita would, in a particular school, would be that kid who would get suspended because she wasn't understood. She would be that kid who would get the phone call if someone in a school like in Dr. Susan S. McKinney, we had strong educators, but if she was in another school, they would have been like, she's a problem. She just doesn't conform, right? And so living in the projects, I wanted to make sure that these young people knew that how valuable they were. And I remember introducing the letter correspondence program to the class. And Nolita was like, well, why are we writing somebody in jail? Why are we doing that? And I was like, just play along, just write the letter. So Nolita, just share a little bit about your experience and the introduction to the program and what it meant for you.
Dr. Lopez, you called
Dr.
me
Boom.
out.
Yeah, you know, I love you.
Calling me out. I love you too. But even just hearing you speak reminds me of, like, you're exactly right. Like, if it wasn't for Dr. Susan S. McKinney and it's really about the relationships. Like, and I feel like even today, there are a lot of people who would say, I still do that. Like, you're asking me to do what? I need to know the why. Like, what's the purpose, pretty much. But I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I see it in my practice that depending on which school you're at or which district, county, you're serving, that Black children can be very problematic when they're just asking a simple question or trying to express themselves. But to get back to the letter correspondence and how that was introduced to us, I mean, luckily it was coming from you and there was already a relationship established in the classroom. I think in the beginning for me, it caught me off guard because it was the sense of, we don't know him. Yeah, I know you. What is this and why? And we don't have anything to do with each other. Like, I'm not in jail. I'm in middle school. Like, what is happening? But I think after maybe like the 3rd or 4th letter, you start to develop this relationship with a person I never met, but the consistency in him asking questions about my day-to-day, what's happening in school, what is it that you want to do in the future? And it's not that, these questions weren't being asked of me at home or in school by great teachers like you. It was just the acknowledgement that you may not, come from, the zip code in which you come from, may not be high SES, or it may not have all the resources, but there are still people who care. And I think that, in addition to what was happening in the classrooms, like I vividly remember us watching the movie of Tookie Williams, like Redemption, and that being explained and that being a thing, like this is happening. And I think the correspondence with Marlon was like, we were, writing to someone who, yes, was in prison, but, he was like our age at the time when, things had happened. And so just the acknowledgement that things happen, and in a lot of ways it's designed for them, like it's set up this way for a reason, but that there's still people who care, there are relationships that are being built. And at the end of the day, you don't have to be what they say that you are. And earlier you did mention like going to prison, being glorified. And I would say like it was just an occurrence. Like it was just, you were just used to it. It's not that I had a vision or that people I hung out with like, oh, we're going to jail, like let's get ready. But it was the idea of like, you knew of somebody who was there, who came back, who's gone back. Like it was pretty much a setup. And when you grow up in the project, so places like Fort Greene and Farragut, it's a lot of times a reality. And I don't want to speak too much, but just to kind of sum up the letter correspondence and just the interaction with Marlon. Again, this was somebody we didn't know, but I can be on a Zoom, on a panel with him today. And we've had conversations in the past, and it's like magic. Like you really played a role in me identifying what was left and what was right, just by sharing your experience and encouraging me, to just do well. Because that's all he was saying was like, make sure you do your work. Like, so, and it was just like, okay, true, I hear you. But again, you don't take those things into consideration until you get older, and it's like, wow, like, what if I didn't have that? You know what I mean? And there are a lot of people who don't have that. And so I'll stop that.
And to that point that you're saying, so yes, I had you all watch Redemption because I also wanted to layer it to say people do actually make mistakes, right? They make a choice and there is a consequence for their actions. And then I had you all write Arnold Schwarzenegger because he was the governor at the time, because you all were like, but what can we do? He shouldn't die. What happened? And at that time, he was still alive. He hadn't been executed. And so you all wrote letters that I literally sent to the governor. And that speaks to education. And when I think about what education looks like now, and even in COVID, we can redefine what education actually needs to be for our children. I didn't ask permission. I didn't ask anybody permission to do what I was doing in my classroom, because I simply understood that how the curriculum was designed and what we were asked to teach them on a day-to-day basis. Yes, it was to get them to the next grade, but my question was like, what are they going to do for their lifetime? How do we actually disrupt generational poverty? How do we actually make sure that our children know what they can do for themselves if we're not closing the gap within that? Like, it wasn't enough for the academic gaps, but it was just like, they are so smart, they're so intuitive, but we're not taking full advantage of that. So by telling them that they could actually become advocates, right? They can actually have a voice. They can actually start speaking on behalf as a community to say, we recognize this person made a mistake, that they made a choice, there is a consequence, but is there another way that we can go about in terms of his life? Can we spare him his life? And for them, they felt empowered, right? And so that was the most important thing. Like, at the end of the day, now you being a psychologist, a licensed psychologist, you practice in schools. For me, the question then goes to, how are you applying this to the work that you're doing? Because you're dealing with children in Baltimore who are similar to the one to who, like how you grew up, right? Lack of resources, same type of economic status. And you have to now advocate for what they need, especially being remote and they're supposed to get services. So what does that look like for you?
Right. It looks like a lot of calling out, like I think we live in a culture where it's like, oh, I want to call people out. But I've realized that my supervisor gave me this really good tidbit. And it's like, instead of calling people out, you have to learn to call them in. And so what I've been doing is a lot of reaching out to families who are, just listed, because I'm dealing with students on my caseload who aren't logging into our Google Meets, who just are trying to keep up with the virtual learning piece. And so for them, having sessions with the school psychologist is like, I got to do this too. And so it's a matter of, it may not look like from 8 to 3. I may be in a session at 6 o'clock. And that's okay with me, because at the end of the day, the service is like, I'm serving the student, I'm serving the families. And so I think what it looks like for me is holding my students accountable, but also checking in with their aunt, their grandmother, their mom. So is there anything that you need? Or, you know, I have students who, a lot of them are, it's like medically complicated. So we're dealing with, yes, COVID, but also now there's transportation issues with getting to the hospital, or not having enough funds to get an Uber, or, you know, everyone doesn't have a vehicle. And so checking in with my resources like social workers, other outside psychologists I know, to really figure out, well, what can I do in this moment? So I think it's really easy to kind of become overwhelmed and say, like, I have to save the world. It's like, no, I don't have to save the world. I just need to deliver what I can for this student in this space and time. And do I always get it right? Absolutely not. But I also give myself grace, and I allow my students to give me grace. And just, I'm understanding that it may not work out, like it may not be picture perfect. And that's a life lesson. So that's what I'm trying to, and it's hard, but that's what I'm trying to get my kids to see, and also remind myself in the day-to-day. Because at this point, you literally can only do your pandemic best, because COVID has shaken up everything. And it's not to say that things were perfect before, because they weren't. And I hope we don't go back to the way that things were, because I think you're absolutely right. So not asking for permission doesn't always have to look like, well, I'm not going to do the curriculum that the county do. But it's like you said, it's getting creative and figuring out, well, what can I do that's also culturally relevant and that my students will be engaged with. And so sometimes I think everyone has this, I would hope that everyone has the same goal, which is to educate students and see them, you know, be the best that they can be. It's just a matter of the route in which you take to get there. And I'm hoping I answered your question.
Of course you did.
But, yeah.
You know, I just want to interject. You know, thinking about, I hear like a through line with you, Dr. Bowman. I'm gonna call you Dr. Bowman.
I mean, you know.
A through line of creativity, right? And I'm just curious in terms of like how you interact with young folks. I'm curious, Dr. Lopez. I'm curious though, like with the program that you had initiated with myself, and eventually that included Dr. Bowman. Did you get permission for that? How did that sort of work out?
I didn't ask permission.
It's better to ask for.
I didn't ask. Right? If I had to do a pen pal program, I didn't need to ask permission for a pen pal program. There was no difference, right? I do remember saying that there's an opportunity for us to have the children receive sound advice from someone who is currently incarcerated. Are you opposed to that? There were no lies in what I said. I wasn't specific on how I was going to do it. I just simply wanted to know, would I have permission to allow someone who was familiar with the incarceration system being able to give sound advice to our young people to ensure that we disrupt the school to prison pipeline? Yeah, by all means. Okay. And so I did what I needed to do from there, right? I think that sometimes in our education system, when we ask permission of people who don't have the vision of what you have or understanding and are not sitting in your classrooms and don't have the relationships with your children, they're immediately going to say no. Because for them, this is not tied to data. For them, this is not tied to our success, overall success of the school, because how do we package this? But for me, it's like, it's not about us packaging it. It's what will our children say when they come back 10 years from now? What will be the legacy that we're leaving right now in the work that we're doing? And this is not about me, it's about them. So as long as I wasn't creating harm, I was reading every single letter. I was the one in charge of reading your letter to them. When they wrote you letters, I would literally read every letter they wrote to you. And then when you wrote a letter, I had to read every letter before I gave it to them. So I ensured there wasn't anything inappropriate, right? But if I would have asked and would have gave the specifics, then I'm sure it would have been another, like there would have been outright no, or I would have to write it in some type of proposal and get the approval. And my thing is, when we're putting test in our schools, when we're being told to use a curriculum that's not aligned to anything that's culturally relevant, that doesn't tell the true history of our people. I'm not asked anything. I'm not asked all those things. So if I could control one thing, it was going to be this. And at the end of the day, the children looked forward to it. If there was one thing they looked forward to, I don't know if it was a Thursday or Friday, it was just like, where's our letters?
Friday.
They looked forward to it, you know? And so Marquise is on as well. So I had no leader in 2004. 2011, Marquise enters Mott Holbrook's Academy. He was my second graduating class. And I don't know if Marquise, you remember this. You're probably going to remember this, right? So something happened. I go into the main office. You're extremely angry. I'm trying to talk to you. You tell me how you hate the school. You don't want to be there anymore. I don't care. I don't want to be here. I'm leaving. I was like, so I need you to calm down. And he was like, I don't care. I'm not calming down. And you punched the wall. And I was like, I went to go get my coat because I was like, oh, he done lost his mind. Because you was like, I'm going to go to 284. I don't want to be in this school. I got my coat. I got my bag. You ran down the hallway like you was out. I had on heels. I flipped off my heels, threw them in my office, and I started running down the hallway because I was like, he ain't going nowhere. I'm going to walk him over there. I'm going to call his mama. And then I brought you back into the main office. And I was like, at some point, you know, God worked on me because in that minute, the Brooklyn came out. I was like, who he think he talking to? And I said, Marquise, this is so unlike you. What's wrong? I think maybe you were actually in 7th grade because 6th grade, you was actually chill. 7th grade was like that turning point. And I said, Marquise, what's wrong? And you literally said, you told me that something was going on. Like your mom had, she was in between jobs. At that moment, she was in between jobs and you were overwhelmed because of the gangs in the neighborhood, because in Brownsville, they recruit kids as early as 4th grade and stuff like that. And you was just like, I just don't want that to be my choice. And I'm just tired. And so at that point, I called your mom. I asked your mom to come up to the school and we had a conversation. And I said to your mom, just let me have him. He could stay with me on the weekends. I'll have him. I'm going to take him out. And I took you to Liberty Fairs. Remember that? The trade show. We went to Chelsea Piers or whatever. And you were into fashion. So we go into Liberty Fairs and we went there, you got to write down designer information. I introduced you to Ouija, all of this stuff. After that, we went to the library. I mean, not the library, the bookstore. You remember that? 14th Street? We can't hear you.
Hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. You guys speak a little bit. You got a deep voice. Don't play with me, Marquise.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you remember what happened when we went into the bookstore?
It felt like a candy store. It was like my first time at a bookstore, like ever. I can't really remember. It was a long time ago. But
what you're describing was exactly what happened when you walked into that bookstore. It was the bookstore on 14th Street, Union Square. And Sine and I were walking and you stopped dead in your tracks. And then you looked around and Sine looked at you. She was like, come on, Marquise. And you were like, what is this? And I was like, it's the bookstore. It's Barnes and Nobles. And you were like, wait, all of this is books? Like, and I was like, yes. And we went to every single floor. And then we got to the magazine section.
Right.
You remember which magazines you picked out?
First one was a Jordan book, like it was full of Jordans.
Uh-huh.
Magazines.
And then you had like GQ Italia, and then you was like the European, and I'm looking at you like, what? Why he just can't get the regular one? And you literally got the ones that were European. And I said, have you never seen magazines like this? And you was like, no, I've never seen magazines. So I told you to get all the magazines that you wanted. And then there was a home magazine, and you sat on the bench and you just kept looking at the home magazine. Like, they had a picture of the ocean, a view from a room with, and you were just like, you put aside the other books and you just kept looking at these magazines, the one with the home. And I said to you, you're going to get that magazine as well, because what I want you to do is anytime you want an escape, anytime you want to be reminded of where you can go, right? Like your dream, your aspiration is one day I want to be able to permanently be able to look out and see this view. And then I got you a sketchbook. And then that sketchbook, I told you, cut out every single picture or draw whatever designs you wanted to design. But that sketchbook was going to be a collection of your dreams, everything that you could possibly imagine, right? And so in that moment, just like Nolita, 7th grade is a pivotal moment, especially for our middle school children, because the grades of 4th grade and 7th grade determine how many prisons we built. And Marquise's behavior, especially for me as a woman, I could have been like, he's out of here. He's suspended. He's punched the wall. He threatened me. But I had to take a second and pause and ask one simple question. What's going on? This isn't like you. Tell me because this doesn't make any sense, right? And in that moment, because of the relationship you and I had, you shared with me what was happening at home. And I immediately said to your mom, just give me Marquise. I will come and get him every weekend. It's not a problem. And then being revealed, like what we don't recognize, especially as educators, those who are on this call, is that we take for granted that we can leave the community that we work in. But the children that we're serving don't have the same opportunities, that they're not allowed to escape, that every single day that they walk into the building that you're serving in, or every single day that they're getting onto a remote, you actually provide them with an escape for everything that's happening in their households. And so sometimes they don't even have the words to say, I'm hurting. I don't know what I'm feeling right now. I'm angry. All they know is that they want to hurt something because they're so angry. And so my job was, I'm going to take him outside of Brownsville. I'm going to give him the experiences that he can't necessarily get, that I know his mother's going to trust me to take him with me, with Sine, and to see him then flourish. So I wanted to share and paint that picture because I want folks to just know that it wasn't just myself, it was a team of educators at Mott Hall who poured into every single scholar, because what I learned with Nolita and every child that I taught at McKinney and every child that I taught at every school after that was that it requires a village mentality. And as educators, we often offer a refuge. And that's why COVID is so hard, because there are children in circumstances that they can't escape. So them not logging on isn't that they don't care. Them not logging on is that they want to just, they have no interest. Them not logging on is because they don't have access. It's because they're taking care of brothers and sisters, and they're often feeling lost.
Your phone while it's on.
So with Marquise, I want to ask you, why is it important for an educator to see you and to know you and to build a relationship? How was that beneficial to you as a scholar at Mott Hall?
As a young scholar at Mott Hall, I was misled. So the conversation I had with you, it put me on another path, not a dangerous path, but a path to get me out of Brownsville where I wanted to be. Like all I saw was Brownsville, and like my family members lives in other projects. So this is what I'm used to. So I got stuck to being used to this, and then you introduced me to something else. If it wasn't for that, I feel like my mom would still be in the gutter.
And so you went on to leave Mott Hall, and you came back and was like, I have another idea. I want to do photography. Remember that?
Yeah.
And what was it about photography that you that excited you or made you want to go into that industry?
It's just like capturing moments and like being recognized for it. That's what I really liked about photography.
And now with fashion design, why
I'm
you go back to fashion design now, like the magazines, but now you're into wanting to create your own line. Share a little bit about that.
I've always been interested in fashion, and like from going job to job through COVID is not what I want to do. I don't want to work for somebody else. I want to be my own boss. And to do that, I want to do something I enjoy, which is making clothes.
Okay. So I just want I'm pulling this out of Marquise because he'll be super shy, right? But one thing he is he's a true creative, and he's very humbled. And so this is why when he got so angry, this is the Marquise I know, who's like very reserved and quiet, right? But in that moment when he was like ready to go, I was like, wait a minute. And so I've always stayed in contact with Marquise. Even if we have long stints that I don't hear from him, I'll just check in. Hey, Muggy, how you doing? How's it going? So like right now, when I checked in with him during COVID, and this is the other thing, like we have young adults, and this is why it's important for us to maintain relationships with our young people, is because just because he graduated Mott Hall doesn't mean that the relationship stops, because the resources need to continue, because he's still in Brownsville, right? And so the reality is that if he's not set up for success, it's easy for him to go down the wrong path. Because as a young man, he still wants to provide for his family. He still wants to be able to maintain his household. And so he has to make decisions. And so I reached out to him. I said, Muggy, how you doing? And he told me about the job. And he was like, I really don't want to do this. Like this day to day, I don't like my job. I really want to get into fashion. And I'm like on this Clubhouse app now, and I had been in a room and I heard a fashion designer and he was talking, and I ended up interviewing him, and he shared about manufacturing and all this stuff. And Marquise said to me, oh, I want to do manufacturing. I just don't know where to start. And I immediately connected the two of them. And so the reason why I'm sharing this is because we can be a resource to our young people. We don't have to wait, right? We can actually connect the dots. And I always will feel like mama bear to all of my scholars. I will always find a way to connect them, right? And so when I spoke the last time, and the first question that came to mind was like, so how can we support? How can we help, right? This is that work. The work is making sure that we stay in communications with our young people, because you have young people in your community. You have young people in your households. You have young people who are struggling, and you have family members who are trying to figure things out. No one wants to fail the next generation, but we have an obligation to say, how can we show up differently? How can we then develop these relationships? But then also going back to the whole point of when I think about the school to prison pipeline, those who have served time are not throwaways. I think that they are the most important assets that we have in our communities because of their experiences. Can help the next generation understand that you don't have to make the same decisions, right? And what they learn while they're incarcerated becomes invaluable information that can be imparted into our young people. And so with Marlon, I wanted to throw it back to you, Marlon, because I know that a lot of your work when you came out of prison was defined around wanting to help the youth, right? And doing a lot of programs. And making a lot of connections. And so what do you see in terms of the work that you've done with Nolita, in terms of the work that you've done with scholars like Marquise at Mott Hall Bridges Academy? What can others do in that same vein to be an asset to our young people?
Well, I think sort of just listening to that story with you and Marquise, particularly that interaction, if handled differently or wrong, or we can say wrongly, could have completely shifted the trajectory for you. It could have, right? It could have completely shifted your entire life story, at least, you know, a good portion of it. I'll say a chapter of your life, if not handled properly. And I think just to reiterate what you said, I mean, obviously it's the relationships and understanding what's happening with folks. Like in this moment now, in this terms of COVID, and because one of the pathways to incarceration is also the foster care system, which is entangled with the school system, right? And even at this moment now, they're saying, there's an estimated 3 million students who are homeless in foster care, and also those who have disabilities who appear to not be in school at all right now, right? And this sort of those are stories of what's happening there. So the way that these students are, as we know, there's a gap happening right now. There's always been a sort of an education gap, but the widening of the gap is not just because these kids are simply from an area. It's part of what's happening in the area that is causing these issues, but also how people are either they are or they are not sort of understanding or building the relationship with these particular young folks in the communities. The relationship is the relationship building is essential. It's the only way that you can see that Marquise needed something more than a safety agent, is the relationship with him. That's the only way you can determine that. And Dr. Bowman, as a school psychologist, I'm sure you would attest to that, right? Like it's the relationship is tantamount to this. And in this moment, I think about in this moment in terms of young people who may have had issues with being disconnected from school or from those relationships when there was regular in-person learning. And now what that looks like when there's remote learning, right? Where they may not have certain relationships with, or people the proper educators may not have the proper relationships with them to understand what's happening with them. And in this moment, the impacts of what's happening now with COVID and education particularly, there's some immediate impacts, but we don't know particularly psychologically the impact of this going further in years to come. I think about my 6-year-old niece, where she's in first grade now, right? Her only interaction, she had half of a school year in kindergarten, and the rest of her school year was remote. And now she's learning first grade remote. You just understand that her introduction to education is this way, right? This is her introduction to folks like Marquise, or just younger students now who may be in junior middle school now. They understand this is an interruption. For some people, this is what it is. This is all for some young people. This is education. This is not an interruption. This is the introduction. And I think this is what I'm thinking about with educators and administrators particularly. That requires a huge shift in understanding what's necessary right now, because you're teaching a whole new population of people in a way in which we've never had to do it in holistically.
And so, Greer, I wanted to know, I wanted you to add into that as well.
We can hear you, I think. Oh no, we can't hear you, Greer. Keep trying. Keep trying. But I think as she works on her microphone, I know Greer works at the Center for Justice at Columbia University. And a lot of their work is revolved around obviously incarceration, but preparing stable pathways for people from incarceration to home, but also in the educational space and academic space as after this as well.
I think she's on now. So we need to mute. I'm gonna mute.
One of the things.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to say the importance of staying connected to the young people and allowing their voices to be heard. A lot of times they have been silenced, right? Some of us grew up, you are seen and not heard, right? And so we have to encourage the young people to use their voices, to use their words to express how they're feeling and what's going on with them, and to be available for them. One of the things that I do is restorative justice circles through the Center for Justice, and that is helping young people, and not just young people, but people connecting, right? To let them know, understanding the root causes and effects of why we make the choices that we make in hopes that we make better choices, right? But understanding that because we come from an environment doesn't mean that we are that environment, right? And like Dr. Lopez said, our young people are so intuitive, are so intelligent, but oftentimes because of behavioral problems, right, that gets in the way of the level of intelligence that they can exude. And it's not until, they get into some trouble that they begin to start showing this level of intelligence where somebody is taking notice, right? They're spending more time on the self. But one of the things that Dr. Lopez said that I definitely wanted to just touch on was, right, that we are all connected, right? There's a term in South Africa called Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, right? And there's no such thing as throwing anybody away, but that's what the system tries to do to our young people, is to arrest them, to convict them, and throw away the key. But there's no such thing as doing that, because once we try to do that, we are throwing away a part of who we are. And so I think it's important for us to always provide spaces, right? And even now we can't be in person to provide these virtual spaces for people to come, the young people to come and share their experiences of what it's like now, right? Dealing with all the things that they're dealing with, but affirming who they are and the things that they're dealing with, but also just being able to provide the space, right? Restorative justice circles have been so instrumental because a lot of students and people say they don't have a space where they can really stand in the truth of who they are, be authentic, and really just tell what's really happening in a confidential way. And so, being able to FaceTime, stay connected via text, right? Whether it's email, but just allowing their voices to be heard. And like Dr. Lopez said, providing the resources, staying connected, right? We all have these vast networks of the, different people that we, do work with, and just connecting the young people with the resources that we have available, I think is extremely important.
I thank you for that and sharing. Nolita, I wanted to point to you in terms of your work, right? And we spoke earlier before getting on the call that you're now, as you move forward, going to be practicing as a licensed psychologist. So that means you will have your own private practice. And I had asked you, like, what is the percentage of people of color, especially Black women, who are even in that industry? I want you to share that statistics, but also your concerns around mental health and what you're seeing with our young people as they're dealing with COVID and remote learning.
Right. So to be specific on the stats related to Black psychologists in the United States, you're looking at, and obviously it depends on which state you're in, but again, across the United States, you're looking at anywhere between 2 to 4% as individuals who have a PhD and who are practicing as a clinical psychologist. As it relates to COVID and I guess not necessarily my thoughts, but my fears and my worries, right? Like now I'm projecting on just like what is to come, because as Marlon mentioned, like this isn't, yes, we're dealing with immediate effects of what's happening regarding COVID and the numbers and the fact that it's hitting us from different angles. So education, the health system, things of that nature. When I think about the young children that are, or that will undoubtedly be impacted, I'm thinking about just pretty much everything, like developmentally, like when we think about, right, and I'm going to bring the aspect of trauma here, because that's essentially what COVID is for a lot of us, like people who are Black, right? It's been a traumatic experience, whether if you've lost, someone in your family, if you know someone who, passed due to COVID, because it's such a residual effect, again, its impact, like now we're seeing, like, I think a lot of us have already known that there has been disparities, or what we consider, what I call an opportunity gap, because yes, it's a part of education, but I think a lot of what we've been talking about thus far has been about relationships and connectedness. So to me, that boils down to the opportunity to have, to know, and being connected in that realm. I'm thinking about just the process it takes to work through trauma, just in general. And then when you add young children, like you have to think about developmental level, that, it's already difficult. It's difficult for adults to process what's happening. And so when you engage or involve children, you have to think about now all that they have to go through. So now I'm expected to, yes, show up. I'm expected to learn. I'm expected to still be present without showing or sharing of how I'm actually feeling or how I actually want to show up. Because again, if we're talking school to prison pipeline, and even the example you gave with Marquise, depending on where you are, it's not safe to do that. Or if you do that, you're already labeled as, well, and again, I work specifically as a school psychologist. So a lot of students who show up with social emotional concerns, whereas sometimes it's just that they're having a bad day, we're in an IEP team meeting and we're talking about emotional disability.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I think even though I'm frustrated with the process, because nothing is perfect, even though I'm frustrated with the process, I'm happy to be in the position that I am because I can identify, well, actually, that's not it. Let's move on. Or like, let's talk about some other supports, resources, things like that. And I think now I'm going to go on a different rant and I don't want to do that. So bring it back to just children and COVID. I think, again, my fear is that at the end of the day, my hope is that we'll allow children to process what's happening. Again, it's not going to be an easy like transition. If we continue to be virtual, if we come back into the schools, like it's not going to be all right, let's go back to 1 + 1 is 2. Like, no, you need to give students, and you also need to give teachers the opportunity to understand what has just happened to them, right? The expectations of them, the why behind now you have us doing this. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it now with children that I'm seeing that they're not okay, right? And it's taking an extra effort just to make sure that they can show up for a Google Meet to speak with me. And we're doing more, feelings-based, scenario-based. I'm not even asking them to write an essay or write a paper. And it's just going to be a transition. And I'm hoping that adults are sensitive enough to the fact that things aren't going to be the way in which they were before COVID. And that we're dealing with a trauma experience for sure.
Let me ask you to that you're saying, the transition. If you could give sound advice, if you can tell educators or policymakers, what would that look like from a mental health standpoint? What should we be doing in our schools in order to prepare for that? Because that is the inevitable and that's the real hard work, but we should not be waiting till September or August to get that done. What can folks start thinking about implementing now?
Yeah, so I think for now, you definitely I guess my advice would be to sit down with self and kind of self-process, like identify, and it's always kind of the base, like I can tell you to deep breathe or to, read a book or go do yoga. But I think if I want to be practical, what I would suggest is to kind of sit down and identify what shows up for you in terms of like, what are your fears when we get back to school? Like, what do you think may happen? Identifying with your school-based community. So it's going to look different. Like in Baltimore, it's going to look different in Maryland, like wherever you are. But if you're working in a school, I would hope that you have relationships with other teachers and your administrators to figure out, pretty much do a needs assessment. Like, what is it that you should know your students. And it's not I'm gonna blame you if you don't, but at the core, you should have an idea of what the needs are for your building. For example, if you're working with students who half of them meet qualifications for like the free and student reduced lunch program, like you should know that, okay, there's a food need. So when we come back, well, what is it that we can do as educators to promote that or to make sure our students have something to eat? If you're talking about curriculum and instruction, well, what we know about COVID is that it has impacted African Americans disproportionately compared to other individuals. So if you haven't had a conversation about culturally relevant instruction before, we should be doing some PDs around that, like pretty much rallying around. If you had an opportunity to sit down with your thoughts and really identify, well, what do I want to come out of this pandemic with? Like, what kind of educator do I want to be? What impact do I want to have on my children? Like that right there is giving you kind of the motivation to go to your administrator or really work on yourself as an educator to go, well, this is what I'm going to do, right? It doesn't have to be this standard protocol that all teachers must do this or they must do that, but it really is thinking about the students in which you serve. Again, this notion of you don't necessarily need permission. Like you want an idea of what you're doing, but that idea should coincide with what is happening in your building. And that's going to look different from educator to educator. But I think, again, at its core, it's about having to sit down with yourself and really identifying, well, what do I want my students to get out of me teaching? How do we move past this pandemic? And there's not going to be a right answer. Because again, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that anything can happen and that we don't have all the answers, but putting your students' needs before anything else.
That makes perfect sense. And I thank you for sharing that. And for folks who are parents on here, what I would thoroughly suggest is know your children, right? This is a perfect time to ask them the questions of, like, if they're in a class, paying attention to what they're doing in class, ask them questions. You don't have to know what they're learning, right? But simply know when they're getting frustrated by certain activities. You can sit in on a class. You don't have to participate. Just see how the teacher is interacting with your child. And the reason why you want to do that is because upon the return of your children into the schools, for many, it will be traumatizing to go back into a school building, right? It's not going to be an easy fix, because now some children are going to be dealing with, as much as they want to be back in the school, some of them will feel an abandonment. They'll have a lot of stress because they've been home for so long. So walking into the building, they may have moments where they will have an acting out moment. And the teachers and the principals or whoever, wanting to get back to curriculum, wanting to be focused on academics, wanting to get focused for the standardized test, all the things that may be happening all at the same time, will then look at this child as there is a problem, right? As opposed to you as a parent need to advocate and say, so I need to share with you what has been going on. I need to share with you some of my concerns that I've seen. These are the things that I'm working on. These are the strategies that I've used in the household. Because what you'll recognize is that some people really don't take the time to learn about your children, but sometimes there's not even enough time in the day, right? So it takes a special, unfortunately, it takes a special person to say, I'm not going to stick to the schedule of 8 to 2:30 or 8 to 3. I'm willing to make the phone call at night to call my parents, 2 or 3 parents every single day, just to check in with them. You know, how's Samantha doing today? Is she okay? Are there any concerns that you've noticed? How can I be a resource to you? And the same thing needs to happen in terms of teachers. Teachers need to do it. Parents need to do it. Reach out. Just let them know if there's something going on. So I just want to let you know, there's a situation that we're dealing with. She may not be able to be online. If she's online, she may not be engaging. It's not that she doesn't want to, but there's just something going on. You don't necessarily have to go in depth, but if you have a good relationship with the teacher or the principal, be able to share as much as possible, because this way a team can rally around that child. Everyone is very clear. They can actually create a plan of action and they can support your children as best as possible. But here's what, unfortunately, folks are trying to figure things out and no one is actually putting together a mental health team, because that's what it really entails. If they put together a mental health team right now, comprised of mental health professionals, not people who have read an article and seem to want to quote folks, people who actually have a license, have done the work, have been in the classroom, not 15 years ago, recently, can sit down and speak to what the environment is looking like at this very moment and what are some strategies and what are some resources that's available. Those are the things that we need to see happen in our community. We want to ask and invite you all to ask questions as well. I just want to say one thing. Go ahead, Chris.
One of the things I do, I wear a lot of hats. I'm an adjunct professor at Columbia University in the School of Social Work, right? And so what I'm seeing, particularly with students of color, is a lot of anxiety, right? This is on a college level, on a graduate level, but a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, and just this level of introversion that is taking place where people are not really wanting to talk about, right, the sorrow and the grief and not being able to express and, even lay their loved ones to rest in a way that we're accustomed to. And so you talked about the importance of talking to the students and finding out, what's going on with the parents, but staying connected, right? And then being able to provide those resources for them, right? So if they're really needing a professional, a social worker or a psychologist or, someone to talk to, that those resources are readily available as well. I mean, what I also know just is that during this time, a lot of therapists are on overload, right? A lot of companies are providing employee assistance programs for people to kind of process through their grief. We need those same resources available for our young people because they are dealing with and processing a lot, but not having the tools or even just the words or the resources to say, right, this is what I'm really feeling, right? But having the professional service and help available to help them talk about that. And the mental health piece is extremely important.
So one of the things that I experienced back in 2009 when I was completing my leadership program through New Leaders, I went to New Orleans. So that was like our final wrap up. And we visited schools in New Orleans. And in many of the classrooms, I saw children who were significantly older than the younger kids in the classroom. So I feel like I was in a fourth grade class, but clearly this young person was like 13 or 14 years old. And I'm thinking to myself, nobody else notices how much of an age difference, especially it being boys in a room full with girls. I was like, nobody notices this. And I said, okay, so can somebody explain to me what's going on? And they said, oh, what happened was a lot of these children are survivors of Hurricane Katrina, and they didn't go to school because they dealt with trauma and they stayed home. Eventually, when they went to school, they were already over age and they were far behind. And so the city of New Orleans did not make provisions for those young people. They didn't create special programming. They didn't provide them with the interventions that they needed. They literally put those children in what they felt were their grade level in terms of their proficiency. And you had a 9-year-old in a room with a 13-year-old. And I thought to myself, how dehumanizing is this for this child? How demoralizing is this for this child? Because he's going to drop out. She's going to drop out. There's no way that they're going to feel, because you feel like a fish out of water. They couldn't even sit in the chairs because it was elementary school chairs. And, those chairs are totally different from middle school and high school chairs. And I bring all of that up because there are going to be some children who are dealing with trauma because they actually endured loss in their households of family members who died because of COVID, who may have died because of another complication not related to COVID, but their family members simply couldn't go to the hospital, right? And so it's going to be difficult. You're going to have the families who don't want their kids vaccinated, and that's going to be another fight. And so I don't know if our education system across the United States is even preparing for that, but that's a reality. And in understanding that, that's why it's so important for us to rally around our families now, because the mental health piece is going to be key. And that's why I asked No Leader about the percentage, because the other side of this is there are a lot of people who are in the profession of mental health who don't understand the culture of our community. And they provide services that's not really services, that can actually do more harm than good. And that's a real concern for me as well, because we all know that it only takes one bad therapist for you to be like, I ain't doing it no more. I will absolutely not go. And that's another trauma. So we have to be mindful of that. And so I want to, again, invite folks, if you have any questions. Tafari, I don't know if you have any questions on your end that you wanted to share from folks who are tuning in. And we want to thank you for staying with us this long.
Definitely, Nadia. Thank you. So yes, I saw 2 questions in the chat. I don't know if they're still on. I believe they are. We had a question from Arlene Berger. She said, how can we show up for our kids now that we are remote? How do we communicate that we are still we are still a safe place for them despite the distance? So if you would like to answer that one. Or
Arlene, is that in terms of the school? Is she talking about?
I believe when you were talking about, I guess you were talking about the story with with Marquise and everything like that. She was in response to that.
It's going to go back to what we keep saying over and over again. Greer has said it, that relationship piece. Like the distance that occurred as a result of COVID, us being on remote, does not mean that you don't continuously check in, right? One of the things that was instituted at Mott Hall during the midst of the pandemic was we had parent check-in every 2 weeks. And we provided the mental health services for our parents every 2 weeks. So in addition to our staff has been receiving mental health services through Aaron Jenkins, who has an organization since I opened up the school, because I felt like to serve in Brownsville, you're going to deal with a lot of vicarious traumas. You're going to be dealing with your own personal traumas. So I can't have an adult be triggered by something that they experience in the building, and then they go off and then they could literally lose their job, right? Because it becomes corporal punishment and all these things. So I made sure that we had those services in place. But immediately when we went on remote, it was important to continue those services. So every single scholar had a champion already. And then we identified those who were most at risk. So if they had a relationship, if I'm their champion, but they have a relationship with Marlon, right? So they go to Mr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson is good with them. That means they now have 2 people checking in with them. We're going to tag team. I'm going to call. He's going to call. He's going to text. We're going to check it with mom. Like, we're going to make sure that this child knows, even though you're not in the building, we're keeping tabs on you. But for the parents, the staff was coming back saying, I'm talking to the parents. They're so overwhelmed. Some of them were dealing with moms going to the hospital, dads going to the hospitals. Like, there was just too much going on. And I said, we actually need to institute parent conferences where we just talk to the parents about what their needs are, give us feedback about what's happening, right? And the AP who at the time, who's now the principal of the school, Karen Cadogan, she made sure all that stuff was instituted. And I said, okay, so we want to make sure that the team is okay. So the team, 1 week they would have their mental health, they would have their Wusai, yoga, they would have mindfulness. And then the next week it was about the parents and the parents getting that. And again, I didn't ask permission. Karen didn't ask permission. We know our community. We can't wait for someone to say to us, well, let's see what we can do. There were parents who were dealing with depression, children becoming suicidal. We know that there are children who cut themselves, and we wouldn't know because we can't see, right? Because they wear long sleeve shirts. If that's happening in a safe space like our schools, what's happening at home where they have no control? So we had to make sure we instituted those things. So I say that to say this: you have to continuously stay in communication with your families. I would push educators to use your voice, not in a way that because all of it is all about how you say things and when you say things to folks. But if you're willing to be the person to gather a committee, create the committee that you need to see as a team and say, okay, what do you know that we need? Who do you know that could be a mental health provider? Let's come up with our own plan and then give it to the administration. So we know your plate is full. We know your plate is full. Here's some things that we want to propose, right? Because it's also the thing that the principal can't think of everything. The principal is inundated with stuff. And sometimes people just need information themselves as the leader to just be given. And then I'll be like, oh, okay, this is a sound piece of information. Yes, let's institute it. But you cannot wait for someone to give you the permission. You can't be apprehensive, because at the end of the day, this is your community. These are your children. This is our livelihood, right? And this is our future.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We have another question from the audience. Mr. John Duke has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Brother John, unmute yourself, show your camera, show your video, so you can ask your question. Unmute yourself, brother, unmute yourself.
Yes,
There you
hello.
go.
Hello, everybody. Great to see what you're doing, Dr. Lopez. I appreciate it. I followed you while I was even inside. you were on a program, all girls group program, but I heard some of your story, how the work that you were doing in Brownsville. So
Thank you.
my question is basically, what do you do when you have these children that are going through these systems and there's not too many people that are like you? How do you combat that? How do you how do you I think that's really what I'm just asking. How do you combat it, and how do parents help you combat this? Because people can really, from my understanding, with the infractions that some of these children get, they carry over to that pipeline to prison. Correct?
Yeah.
So how do we help besides having a webinar? How do we help assist?
You have to be present. And when I say being present, those those PTA meetings are actually important. Like a lot of times parents don't show up to PTA meetings simply because, and they should be having the PTA meetings, especially now virtually. Parents, if you had a negative interaction when you were a kid, the likelihood of you showing up in PTA meetings, you don't want to do it. Sometimes you just feel overwhelmed and you don't want to participate. So one, participating in PTA meetings, even if you're the only parent with the voice. The second thing I say is that you can always reach out to the principal. You can reach out to the superintendent. You can build relationships with the teachers. You can ask them, what are your needs? How can I be of assistance? How can I help? Right? Some of them, the principal might say, oh, I don't have anything. I'm good. Then go to the assistant principal. Oh, I'm good. Go to the guidance counselor, because sometimes they're so far removed, they don't know what's going on. Go to the people that you can have relationships with and ask them, how can I be of assistance? For me as a teacher, my parents asking me or coming to me and saying they had a resource was the best thing in the world, because sometimes I don't even know that my parents had resources, right? I actually am thinking, maybe you don't have the capacity, but it's also because no one ever asked them. No one ever created the space for them to feel invited to provide anything. So build those relationships, step in, lean in, make sure that they know that you're available. Don't take no for an answer, and ask the children, ask your young person, what do you think they could do in the school to make things better? Right. And when they tell you, go back to the school and say, I was speaking to my child and they said that this would be better if we did this. Do you have that available? And if they don't, how can I be of assistance? I actually have some people, or what can I do to support you? Right. Because I'm going to be honest, educators can be egotistical and controlling. And they don't want to say that they don't know. And they don't want to say that I don't have the answer. And this is not a time for that. It's never been a time for that. So you just have to push and be present and just keep building those relationships.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, John, for that question. Next, we have a question coming from Devin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this broadcast. My question is, I want to know, are there any mainstream resources that Black and Brown children or parents can call in the event that they may have any issues, trauma, just to vent, mentorship, anything that they can call and reach out to? Because my mom, she does work for the Department of Education, and her job is to call students to see if they're missing class, if they're coming late to class, what's going on, if they failed the class. And a lot of parents call her and respond and say, you know what? I don't know what to do with my child. I need help. So is there any type of resources that we can give to parents and or children via social media, via Facebook, via just any type of phone numbers that they can reach out to just so they can get help? Because a lot of times we can ask the schools, do you need help? We can ask them, but they may say, you know what, I don't even know what you can do. So is there anything that this platform is discussing that we may create or just have like a listening ear? Like, I remember when I was a kid, they used to have 1-800 teachers. So what exactly have so that these students can not feel so much alone, because a lot of students, they're not used to the technical era of sitting behind a computer and doing their work. A lot of them just saying, you know what, whatever, I don't care. So what can we give these students so that they can feel safe and secure, like our other types of students who are non-Black and brown, that we can give them that support? Do you, can you recommend anything?
So thank you so much for the question, Devin. So in that vein, if they're in New York, specifically for New York, there is Thrive NYC. You can Google that number. There is an 800 number that provides support. But I'm going to be honest, I don't know the age range, right? And Arlene put it in New York City as well. There are 800 numbers. There are resources that are there. The thing about with young people is that because of the age, that becomes a touchy subject, right? Because technically, if they're not 18 or above, they still need their parents for someone to provide the service. And then you have to make sure that the person is equipped to deal with children. So I'm going to say, I don't know if there's specifically something in place because I've never heard of it. This is an opportunity for someone who may be on the line. There obviously is a void and a need. Because it doesn't exist, someone needs to create it. And this is when those things come to pass. Like literally someone can propose this being something that needs to be done for young people and get it funded, because it's a day and a time where people are providing funding, and and you have the numbers, you have the data. But schools are supposed to create that. That's what the Department of Education put a mandate, right? Without really making sure the adults were equipped to do it. So what they did was provide training, all of this crisis intervention. When they did it like in the middle of the pandemic and during the summer. And the first question I asked was, did they even ask the adult if they were okay? And they never did, right? So there are folks who, are doing their best to provide those services, but they don't actually have the capacity to do that. So each school can provide it. Like I can only speak to Mount Hall. They continue on to call children, to check in with the children. They have the services to provide the parents, but it comes down to the vision of the school, the capacity of the leader, and the resources that they have. So a lot of it is going to require someone, maybe yourself, maybe you create a committee of folks to say, this is something that we need for our community. And it could be done. And if there are people who have resources, please put it inside of the chat, because I don't know all things, but I do know that for our children specifically, there's nothing that we have readily available.
Okay, in regards to that, I see there is a resource someone put in the chat, edsource.org/2020 things teachers can do to address student trauma, especially during distance learning. So if you look in the chat, we could definitely share that information. And this information will be available after this event, so we'll definitely be able to get that information out. Next, we have a question from the brother Malik. Malik, you're on.
Hi, first I want to thank all the panelists for sharing. And I want to thank you and Marquise for sharing that story. What you demonstrated was an art form called listening to what's not being said. And as a mentor, I practice this every day. But for those who don't know how to do this, what do you suggest a first step is for someone to practice that art form of listening to what's not being said, but then acting on it as you did?
It requires training. It requires education. So my background is in nursing. So before I went into education, I was in the world of nursing, and it was taught to us, like that's the holistic approach. So in order for us to be the best at our work in that field, you have to literally listen to the patient. You have to ask them questions. You have to know how to ask them the right question. You have to know when to lean in, and you have to know when to pull back. And so I did that. And then I worked at Bell Atlantic before it was Verizon, right? And when I was there, dealt with account collections. And so the customers were always angry at me because their phone was cut off. But what I had to listen to is that they're not angry at me, they're angry at their circumstance. And so for those who are in education, it's not taught in schools anymore. It's not part of the school of education. You're not taught to do that. I just believe that when you get into education, you have to lead with your heart first before you start with the mind. And when we talk about schools and we talk about our work and it's our calling, I can only say my connection to God. God loves me, right? He loved me enough to allow me to be in this position to love these children. So I listen with my heart. And so I lean in and I ask them how they're doing, because when you're taught, wake up and you say to someone, how are you feeling? Or good morning, how are you, right? You have to want to do that work. And you also have to find mentorship, and you also have to find out who are the successful educators in your building who have those relationships. Like, why is it that Ms. Johnson never has issues with the kids? And you know what's also interesting? There's a episode on The Wire. Season 4, it's all about education. And the police officer goes into the school system and he's having all these issues. And then one day he goes and he looks at the teacher and he just stands by the door and he realizes the same kids that he had, like, why they not acting up with him? And it's because they build relationships with them. Right. And so some of that is just being able to pay attention to that and just knowing, what do you want for yourself? Like, even just starting with that, what would you want somebody to do for yourself? And that's how you have to show up. Even if you never received it, if I could just think about going to school, if a teacher just could remember my name or just to say good morning to me. When I walk into a classroom, I'm going to make sure every single morning I say every single child's name and I say, how are you today? I hope that makes sense.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. I do see a question, Tafari. I'm going to reach in. I saw Kanoy.
Nadia, hold on one second.
Okay.
Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. Brother Marlon, I know you getting ready to go. Would you like to add anything before you leave?
Well, I mean, it's always an honor to be on these platforms, right? Just one little quick story, and I think it's similar to Dr. Lopez's story that speaks to young people in various different places. So several years ago, I had worked at a alternative to incarceration program, right? And I was like a mid-level manager at this organization. So it wasn't my job to really interact with young people on a day-to-day basis, right? My role was much more external with other organizations. But as being who I am in this agency, I would always just sort of make sure I built a relationship with the young people who were coming here to the program. Hey, what's up? Good morning. How you doing? I like those sneakers, those sort of things. One particular day, I'm sitting in my office and I hear a commotion. And so I go out to the office and I see it's one of the young people. He's about 17 in this alternative incarceration program. And he's arguing with the supervisor of the clinical department. And it was getting out of hand. All the F words was coming out. So I was like, hey, come here. And I knew his name and he just kind of walked over me, as he's walking away. He's still cursing lady out, but he's walking with me. I'm not giving you exactly how it happened. I sit him down in my office, just sitting down, having breathed a couple of times, for a few minutes. And then he tells me a whole bunch of what happened. And the story that happened is really quick, was that he came late to the program that day and the facilitator and let him into the door. So he was banging on the door and they kicked him out. And then he got mad and then the clinical counselor came. But no one asked him why he was late. So I was like, so what happened? Why he was late then? And so happened that he was couch surfing. He was homeless. He was sleeping on trains. He got arrested the night before for being on the subways. So he got out the precinct late. He came straight from the precinct to the program. No one asked him, and then find out other things that was going on in the young man's life. I'm saying that so the story, because the young people who are in educational institutions, who are normal educational institutions, K through 12, not all our young people are there. some of our young people are also disconnected from school. They are in alternative incarceration program, they're on probation, or they're managing both. And I just want to the thing I just want to leave with is that the young people who may be the most disconnected from school are dealing with the same things that the folks who are connected to school are dealing with. They're just probably, there's nuance to the situations, but probably they don't have the type of support that a Marquise had with a Dr. Lopez, right? And that could have been, and that's really the difference, but it's the same issues. And I mean, I want to leave with that tidbit because we're thinking about disrupting the school to prison pipeline. Sometimes we assume, and Nadia, Dr. Lopez alluded to this, sometimes we assume that some young people who are like in that pipeline already, like in that motion to that pipeline, don't need resources that are other than like law enforcement resources, right? They also are going through trauma, right? That are impacting the person who had two parents in the household. They may have two parents in the household too, but they're still going through different things. I just want to like put that in here, and that it just underscores the importance of the relationships, but also going outside of your role. My role in that organization was not to interact with participants and clients. That was not I wasn't getting paid for that. That was not on my job description, right? But my understanding what the importance of the relationship, understand that I had to go outside of my job description to do the job that I'm really there to do. And the job that we're really there to do is bigger than the paycheck. I think Dr. Bowman sort of speaks to that. Dr. Lopez speaks to that. But thank you, everybody. And I write about a lot of these things, including the program with Dr. Lopez and Dr. Bowman in the book I have coming out, Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist freedom song. You can pre-order it now. It comes out April 13th. But I speak a lot about these things, but also from a personal perspective, from my own experiences being that kid to being an adult.
Marlon, did you put it in the chat?
No, I put it in the chat right before I leave. Thanks for that reminder.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Marlon, thank you for that. And definitely thank you again for being one of our panelists tonight. Okay, we're trying to stick to the time that we set, and it's 5 minutes over. So we got one last question, and we're gonna ask Kanoy to ask her question.
Wow, thank you so much for saying my name properly. I'm so honored. Thank you. Marlon, it's so nice to—
That was Nadia's job.
The guy that Nadia has talked about so many times. So thank you to all of the panelists here tonight. So the question I have has to do with teachers. And Nadia, you talked about being creative and not asking permission, you know, with programs that you felt were important for your scholars. And I think a lot of teachers want to do this, but they don't know how, and that's fair. They're trained to follow rules. They're trained to follow protocols. They don't want to get sued. They don't want to get fired again. That's fair. So my question is, what steps can teachers take to begin adopting the mindset that you have? You know, what advice can you give them to help them begin stepping out of their safe zone and getting comfortable with that form of creativity?
You know, it starts as simple as with the lesson plan. Like, start where you're at. Like, don't try to create a program tomorrow and say, I'm gonna implement this. How are you remixing the lesson plan based off of the curriculum they've given you in your school, right? So let's say it's a history lesson, and the history lesson, like for me, I would teach colonization, and my kids couldn't get it. So I taught them about gentrification. They understood gentrification. They understood folks coming into their neighborhoods, taking over, and then they get all the resources that they should have gotten before. So here comes colonization. Someone comes in, they take over your territory, they bring other things in that destroys and kills you and starts minimizing the people around you. And that made it a connection. We talked about manifest destiny. I talked to the kids about, okay, I asked them, you know, here is an opportunity for you to leave the projects, right? I gave them a flyer. They could move to sunny Florida, gated community, all of this great stuff. And how many of y'all would leave? I was like, you have security, it's gated. They were like, yo, we want to go. And I remixed it. I said, this is what happened, manifest destiny. The Native Americans was given this idea that they were going to go to a better land, and they were in a gated community, the reservations, and they had security. It was Army folks who wasn't letting them go. And so there's no difference, right? I didn't ask the principal how I should do it, right? Because I'm sure they would have been like, but that's not how New York State wants you to teach it. But my kids won't understand it, right? So I have to make the connection between history. And once you start doing little things like that, then it becomes easier for you to say, you know what? I recognize that who they are is missing from what we're doing. And sitting with them and saying, what do you like? So kids used to stay with me all the time and do dance and cut up t-shirts and do all this stuff. Okay, so maybe it's important for me to bring a fashion designer during lunchtime if I can't do it during class time. Or maybe I could do it as class time, as a homework assignment. You're going to write down some questions and I'm going to bring somebody in. And so I would do that. And then I would see how excited they were. That made me excited. And so once when you start to do that, one, you gain the reputation. The kids are talking about how great your class is, right? Your friends now want to participate. And so you find purpose in doing other things, which makes it easier. Oftentimes people, they're afraid of what their principals are going to say, but they're also afraid of the failure that comes with it. Like if it's not successful, oh my God. But at the end of the day, if your kids are excited and they love what they're doing, that's all that really matters. You're willing to take the heat as long as the kids, because the kids will have your back. Why we can't do it anymore? And then you have relationships with parents who are like, oh my God, Miss Lopez did X, Y, and Z in her class. We need to have more of this. And they become your advocates. So for me, it's always starting small, remix the things that you can remix, that you have control over, and then think bigger, as you develop your capacity. Like I didn't start doing programming until maybe like 2 or 3 years later, or when I went into a new space. I didn't necessarily do it in that school with Nolita. It was little things. Then when I went to another school, I started doing big things. And then I became an AP, and then I became a principal, and that's all we did. But it started small, and I built my craft around that. And so, so I encourage folks to start small.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you to all the panelists. Greer Ellis, Marlon Peterson, who's no longer with us. Dr. Nolita Bowman, Marquise Williams is no longer with us as well. Just want to say thank you to all the panelists for doing a wonderful job. Thank you for sharing your expertise. As our Thomas Edwards said, you guys are the experts. That's why we brought you here. Definitely want to thank you. Want to thank all the attendees that came on tonight and joined us. And I know and trust that you guys.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I just have one last point. So in the chat, Monica Chu had put in a link. And so people have asked, how can they help? And the last conversation that we had, Greer was like, so what can I do? How can I help? And I want to say, thank you, Greer. That night, Monique and I got together and we were like, we have to do something. So the Bridge to Brilliance, which is my nonprofit, is www.bridgetoBrilliance.org/occupy-schools. We have created a hub, if you will. So to folks who want to volunteer their time to be able to speak to schools, our young people, become a speaker, we're only asking you to volunteer no more than 2 hours. That means you could speak at multiple schools. That will be greatly appreciated. If you have a resource, if you want to adopt a class or adopt a school, that's also provided in this resource. So now teachers will be able to say, these are the things I need from my class. These are the things I need in order to get my instruction or support my children. And you can actually sponsor a class or a school. So please take advantage of this opportunity. The same way, like when Devin asked that question, Devin, we didn't have an idea. Like I was like, oh, people can go out and they can actually volunteer. And it was like, well, where can you find it? And I was like, Monique said, well, obviously we got to create it. So that's what we did. So Greer, thank you so much for putting that fire underneath us and trying to bridge the gap. And Nolita Bowman, I want to publicly say I'm so proud of you. And the fact that you were one of my scholars back in 2004, and now you're a doctor and you are serving your community. And as a Black woman, where we are underrepresented and often the super women always wearing the cape and never taking it off, I want to thank you for continuously devoting yourself to pouring into your calling. because you didn't have to go above and beyond, but you are doing it. And you make me so proud as your former teacher, but now your fan.
Okay. Again, thank you, everyone. Definitely would be missed without acknowledging our executive director of the Circle of Support, Ms. Rebecca Vandermeulen. Definitely thank you for your leadership and your assistance in putting this together. Also, Thomas Edwards, who opened up for us. And on behalf of myself and the rest of the organization, I want to say good night to everyone. Have a good one.
I just want to say one thing before we go, and that is, number one, just thank you for inviting me, but also to encourage parents to ask for what they need. Right? Yeah. Sometimes they need and they don't ask. To encourage the parents to ask for what they need, because once they ask, the resources can be provided. Thank you all, and have a wonderful and blessed evening, and a happy holiday to all.
You too. Thank you, Greer.
Good night to everyone.
Good night.